Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we have viewers across the West Coast, East Coast in US, in Europe, and a couple of them or a few of them from Asia. To everyone joining us, thank you. I have a terrific lineup of thinkers today for you on the topic into the metaverse. Is this the new internet? Is there a business application for it? What technologies will this push? How will this change our social fabric and behaviors? And much more from these two thinkers. And before I pass it to them for their introductions, this morning I was thinking about what is the best way to describe catching up to the future. Then I realized that actually the best way to describe it is we're not trying to catch up with future, but we're actually trying to catch up with Star Trek. And I have two prolific speakers and thinkers today, Peter Evans and Professor George. Both of them I worked with over the past year and a half, and really amazing thought leaders, imagination-centric, future-centric thinkers. So with that, I would request actually both of them to just introduce themselves. Peter?
Great. Thank you so much, Hari, for inviting me to join this conversation. So I'm Peter Evans. I'm the managing partner of the Platform Strategy Institute. And since March, I've been deeply involved in a startup called The Record Shop, which just launched 2 weeks ago, which is an NFT marketplace for music, which I'm very excited about. It's taking off like a rocket. I'm also involved in Caltech. I'm a course leader there, so that's exciting. And I also teach a course on platform strategy with Jeff Parker at Dartmouth.
Thank you, Peter. Professor George?
Thank you, Hari, and thank you all for coming today. My name is Djorgovski, and I'm a professor of astronomy and data science at Caltech. I'm a director of the Center for Data-Driven Discovery at Caltech. And I'm also co-founder and chief virtual reality officer of a startup called Virtualitics. My interests are in general how's computing and information technology changing the way we do everything, science and everything else. And I've been involved in what you may want to call metaverse affairs for over 12 years now. I was director of the first professional scientific organization based on virtual worlds. And I've been doing research and development in this arena for quite some time now. So I'm very excited to see that metaverse is now becoming again a real topic of conversation. You have Mark Zuckerberg declaring Facebook to be a metaverse company, Epic Games getting $1 billion of investment to build infrastructure for it, and so on. So I look forward to the rest of this discussion.
Thank you, Professor George. The most important part for any leader is to be curious. And the reason I mention that is because at Caltech Executive Education, we help curious leaders change the world. So today's conversation is to help curious leaders change the world in how they think and apply the new trends in our marketplace. So while Peter is going to talk about metaverse from a platform strategy play and an ecosystem play, Professor George is going to come at it from both a multidimensional data modeling interface technology play. And at the intersection of it will be some really fascinating ideas for all of you. So without much waiting now, let me first invite speaker Peter, if you can request you to give your opening thoughts.
Sure, thanks. So I guess the first question is there value for companies to invest in the metaverse or metaverse capabilities? And I think the answer is yes, and we'll discuss that today. And I have a few thoughts on that one. The second question is how do you extract value from the metaverse? And that's a bit more complicated. But I think the first step is not to think of the metaverse as just a digital world or a game, but actually as a platform. And this requires understanding how platforms create value to understand how the metaverse can create value. So there's a couple of dimensions to that. One is the role. Are you going to become a platform owner? That is, you will actually set up the platform of a metaverse and run it. And so you become the facilitator of the interactions that take place on that platform. And there are a growing number of those that are emerging right now. And they're actually turning into almost SaaS platforms where you pay a subscription to actually run your own metaverse. And so those kinds of companies are emerging. Obviously, you can also become a platform participant, and that is just to be strategic and look around and see who else is building these platforms and figure out ways to actively engage. And then the third is to become a platform complement. That is to be one of the contributors to value creation on those platforms. And we're seeing an explosion of complements now that offer all sorts of different capabilities that enhance the value of these platforms. The other thing to think about is the type of platform. Is it a double-sided or multi-sided? And I think most of the most successful platforms in the metaverse are going to be multi-sided. That is, they're going to have a variety of participants, and they're all going to have different roles on the platform, and they make those somewhat more complicated, but you can extract a lot more value if you think about a metaverse as a multi-sided platform. The other are the complements, and that's a fancy term for the community, the partners, how you generate content. Does it come from celebrities, for example, you invite, or is it user-generated content, or is it from influencers? So this speaks to the explosion of what they call the creator economy now, and there's just all sorts of different ways of bringing these complements that add value to the multiverse, metaverse environment. And then there's also the growth. How do you attract users? And this is where network effects come in. So what are the underlying economics of how these platforms operate? And essentially what you want to do is identify areas in which you can harness network effects to drive that flywheel effect, where more users attract more users, which attract more complements, and vice versa. And so you can really take off. There are just so many use cases that are exciting in this space, and we see them pop up, new ones pop up because there's a ton of innovation taking place. There's events, even the banking industry, finance. Just recently saw a tax automation company build a metaverse for its user conference. There's obviously educational applications, and then there's music, sports, and gaming, so the whole entertainment world as well. So I think there's this just huge diversity of use cases in this area. So let me close by just highlighting 4 key points that I think are important for business leaders to consider. One is that there are billions of dollars now flowing into this space, and that is going to make the user interfaces better and more sophisticated very quickly. And so the pace of change in this space is going to pick up very, very quickly. So that speaks to the need to pay attention and get on board. The second is there's going to be new job opportunities and new roles for companies. People who manage these, people who interface, people who host events. So thinking about what your job roles are going to be in the company vis-a-vis the metaverse. You also, the metaverse will go hand in hand with the rise of non-fungible tokens, NFTs, because that gives you digital ownership that has lots of really interesting use case applications. So you should think about your metaverse strategy in conjunction with your NFT strategy. And then finally, the metaverse will become another key asset for the enterprise. Companies have their physical assets, and increasingly more and more value is created through their digital assets. The metaverse will become another one of those digital assets that the company will have and need to manage for growth and value creation. However, as we know, intangible assets have different characteristics than tangible assets. They're actually a little bit harder to account for. Traditional accounting systems don't do so well with intangible assets, so you have to take that into consideration. And so it also affects decision making. It's harder to show your boss, hey, this is going to have XYZ return, because of the nature of intangible assets. They're a little bit more difficult to pinpoint a direct ROI on them. And this is also a new innovative space. So there's going to have to be some risk taking. But that's the nature of the way that intangible assets are forcing companies to think about how to manage these in a different way than they do their traditional assets.
Thank you, Peter. I do have a couple of questions to you, but I'll hold on till
Okay.
we also listen to Professor George. So let me bring Professor George onto our main screen, and Professor George, all yours.
Well, thank you, Harry. I would try to take a little higher bird's eye view on this and then maybe get into more details later. And first, the question is, well, what are the paths to the metaverse? I assume most of this audience has looked into it at least somewhat, and you know about the origins of the term in cyberpunk science fiction, like Snow Crash, like William Gibson's novels and stories, and also work of the computer scientists in the 70s and 80s for Gellertner's concept of mirror worlds and so on. So this is something that has been thought about both in arts communities like science fiction, but also professional computer science community for quite some time. There are many definitions. You can look them up yourself. Mark Zuckerberg recently defined it as a virtual environment where you can be present with people in digital spaces, an embodied internet that you're inside of rather than just looking at, which I think is a very perceptive comment. I'd like to ask actually a question: what is metaverse for? And the way I see it is to be a universal, open, persistent, shared virtual space where humans can interact with each other with information constructs of all kinds and even control processes in the physical world. It is not a game or a collection of games, not a virtual world or collection thereof. Those are really kind of meta villages, not metaverse, but they are valuable experiments in what metaverse ought to be. So it's all that and much more. In a way, it's like the web, but in 3D and with avatars. So that actually leads me to my main point here, that the metaverse is already here, except it's in 2D and it's called the web. That fulfills all of the functionalities that are really expected of it. And well, avatars so-so, right? So the web is the 2D metaverse today, and that's where all of the information is. That's where all of the human information constructs are, where a lot of our activities are, whether it's work or socializing or commerce or entertainment or learning. And the metaverse will have to therefore grow out of the 2D web and be downward compatible to it, because you are not going to replace and rebuild all this information cyber infrastructure tissue, which is essentially our parallel world already. Now, the reason why web has taken over the world is that it's open, and metaverse will have to be as well. We'll tap into the creativity and talents and skills and capital of the whole world, not just a handful of companies. It's thinking of companies running their own metaverses or being the metaverse is like thinking America Online was the internet. Well, what happened to them? No, it is going to be this new, evolved global cyber infrastructure, which essentially does not replace, but just supersedes the existing web today. That has all kinds of implications for the standards, for the development, interoperability, etc., and so on. And you should really think of it. What will the future workplace look like? Think what was the workplace like before the web. People are shuffling papers, moving atoms from here to there, and see how much that has changed since the early 90s. Well, we're going to see similar qualitative change as the web grows to be 3D or metaverse, as you call it. There is one aspect that, well, two, that I would like to point out, which is why is 3D so important? And why the heck do we need avatars? Well, this is really a part of the continued evolution of the human-computer interfaces, or human information, or human-human interfaces. It started with handwritten letters, and then mail, and then there was telegraph, and radio, and television, and now internet. And the theme that goes through is that communications between humans and other aspects of the world are getting to be ever more immediate and ever higher fidelity and easier to intuitively identify with. So we are basically optimized through millions of years of evolution to live in 3D world and interact in 3D world, which is why the avatars are important. Jeremy Bailinson, scientist at Stanford, has introduced this term of the Proteus Effect, people identifying with their digital representations. And that can be very powerful. Those of you who are well-versed in virtual worlds and some video games understand this very well. And now we see a big rise in virtual human technologies, which are used for all kinds of things, whether it's virtual influencers and actors, as concierges, interfaces to AI, and so on. Well, I think we're going to see more of that. Why? Because humans would rather interact with other humans or representations of other humans rather than with some black boxes or impersonal equipment of some kind. And one thing that I'm very strong believer in is that avatars will have to be kind of realistic-ish humans as opposed to some childish cartoons, which is what you see a lot of now. Who wants to look like a juvenile representation of a toddler with a gigantic head? No serious person would want to do that. And there are reasons why people do this. It's hard to cross the uncanny valley. But I am pretty sure that we will all have reasonably realistic, perhaps cosmetically improved, representations of ourselves as avatars, and we'll interact with other people and AIs in similar form. And that's actually a non-negligible part of it, because AI is probably the most transformative technology in the history of the world, maybe except fire. And it's changing everything, and it's going to continue changing everything. And one of the important aspects of that is how do we interact with AI? And a lot of people are getting onto the point that, well, AIs should be represented as virtual humans. Anyway, so there are many enabling technologies that are currently being developed vigorously, because everybody knows there are huge commercial and other drivers to do this. Many of you are probably familiar with Matthew Ball's descriptions of what metaverse is or should be, or how we get there. And if not, I highly recommend it. I'll put a link to that in the chat later. And there are many technologies, not just the display devices, headsets, which are currently way too clunky to really achieve high uptake, holographic display devices of all kinds, haptic technologies, smart contact lenses, and so on and so forth. Matthew Ball really addresses those much better than I would. And in the sense that we're going to see deeper interlacing of cyber world with physical world, perhaps through Internet of Things and then distributed spatial computing and so on and so forth. There's a lot of work to be done, not just in technology development, but agreements on standards, interoperability, and so on and so forth. These technologies, I think, are going to really hit the stride over the next 5 to 10 years, maybe 20 for the more difficult ones, but they're unstoppable. This is going to happen. The last point I would like to make is that today we already have sort of partial VR, which we call it partial VR, which would be like VR-like representations of people in the world, but seen through regular flat screen devices. And that's, of course, what precursors in form of virtual worlds and games already do. People are already used to them. And why is this important? Because it's here now and it works. It's maybe 80–90% as good as the full-blown, easy, immersive VR or extended reality will be. But already we can use those initial, well, meta villages or sandboxes or laboratories of metaverse to start developing both the structures, whether they're commercial, social, or entertaining, as a gateway to the future, better executed full 3D metaverse. So with that, I'll stop and I'll also happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Professor George and Peter. I'm going to put a question for you. This is from a dear friend of ours and also from Caltech Executive Education. His name is Helene Waynes from Emphasis. He says, in our team, we struggle with terms like suite of platforms or now multiverse. What is the common glue? Do they have common operating system? Or what is the underlying technologies that they interface with?
Well, that's an excellent question. I was kind of implying this, that currently all different companies, whether it's games companies, Facebook, which is aspiring to be the leader in the field and maybe is, are trying to push their own software architecture and standards and so on and so forth, which I think is short-sighted view. The reason why web succeeded is there was open standard sets and that everybody agreed on things like TCP/IP protocols and packet switching and everything. HTML is a universal standard, will be replaced later with other stuff. So in my mind, open, mutually agreed upon technologies like that are the necessary condition. Now, Google didn't invent their own internet, neither did Facebook and so on. They operate on this underlying global cyber infrastructure tissue that everybody agrees with and everybody can build their own website. And the same thing, I think, will be necessary for the development of companies or platforms or whatever you want to call them. That will be riding as manifestations or applications on top of metaverse underlying 3D internet. And so that's why I kind of said that, well, there's going to be a lot of work to agree on all those things and establish them in the same way that World Wide Web Consortium pretty much governs how a web can be used. There has to be outgrowth of that. But we don't know any details, right?
Yeah. And for some reason, the LinkedIn username doesn't show up, but I know who it is because on my other screen, I can see it. This is a gentleman called Peter Gubel. He is a dear friend of mine, and we worked together in the past for an engineering company. He's asking this question or comment from all the way from Bavaria in Germany. So his comment is, it'll be interesting to see which hardware will finally enable a real metaverse experience. And this comment can be to both of you to comment upon.
Peter?
Yeah, sure. I thought George's point about you can actually experience the metaverse now through a normal, computer screen. And I think if you're looking at kind of the latest tech and the most immersive experiences, sure, there's folks working on that. But if you're interested in broad-based opportunities to build a business or engage in a metaverse application, there's already tools to do that. So I guess it depends on kind of what you're thinking about and how you want to create value here. I think just as in blockchain, there are multiple blockchain protocols. There are going to be a variety of, metaverse infrastructure. The question is what can you build on that with respect to businesses? And I think we're going to see a proliferation of various different platforms on top of the metaverse architecture, which builds already on Web 2, right? And I think this issue of standards is interesting because there is more value if somebody can buy something like a wearable in one platform and then port it to another one. And I think people are kind of sorting that out. If I stand up a platform that's a metaverse, do I enable and allow participants on my platform to take something? And we're seeing this in the NFT space. For example, you can buy digital art in one platform and then take it and resell it on a larger platform like OpenSea. And that's enabled because of blockchain technology that exists. So I think it's very interesting how this is going to play out. And as you think about investing in a strategy, thinking through, do I want to create a closed platform? And there's a tremendous amount of value in doing so because you can create exclusivity, which can be a reward for your customers. So I don't think everything has to be open. It's nice if the infrastructure is open so everybody has access to it. But creating value on it, I don't think everything has to be open. That then you create an open commons system. And I think what the explosion of NFTs is showing is that there's tremendous value in ownership. And we're moving to a different model as a consequence, which creates huge incentive for more innovation because people can capture the value of it. One of the things that I saw last week that was pretty interesting and exciting is that there's a new restaurant that's going to open up in New York City, which will be an NFT restaurant. You need to own the NFT token to have a table at that restaurant. Now that's in the real world. I think we're going to have is very similar kind of cases in the metaverse where you need a certain token to be able to enter into and engage on certain metaverse platforms.
Well, coming back to the question of hardware, I mean, there are many different kinds of hardwares that are essential here. And it's not just the audiovisual displays for the users. Current clunky headsets, whether it's AR or VR headsets, are just not easy enough to use. They're too expensive and they do not have sufficient resolution, refresh rates, field of view, and so on and so forth. They're getting rapidly better, and they are going to be better. And I think most people believe this is not going to take off until there is something as easy and convenient as glasses that I'm wearing or smart contact lenses. But there are also other ways of mimicking holographic displays without actually having to wear anything. So that's in one direction. The other direction, the haptic technologies, how do you capture human movement and facial expressions and so on and so forth. And then there is an underlying technology of that, having powerful enough compute and graphics to actually render all that in real time and sense everything in real time. And you need underlying bandwidth way past G5 to be able to actually move all these bits around the world and be synchronous and all that, and so on and so forth. Again, I think Matthew Ball's set of introductory articles, I guess, about metaverse goes into a lot of these details. And then you come to things like security and safe commerce and how do you move money around. Those were all essential kind of meta technology or software technologies that had to be developed. Without commerce, web would have failed, right? And so whether it's going to be NFT or some other blockchain manifestation or something entirely different, we don't know yet. But obviously they're going to be very strong drivers. Cybersecurity is clearly a very big deal. And I think essentially internet as it stands has failed in it because it was never designed to be what it became. It was designed to be a very limited network of nodes between trusted participants, and the underlying architecture of the internet is really not cyber security friendly. And so a lot of people worry a lot about it and try to do things. Once you start moving into distributed spatial computing and Internet of Things, which is a security nightmare, things are going to get a lot more interesting, right? And so those are highly non-trivial problems that need to be developed, both highly non-trivial hardware and highly non-trivial software. And that's why I said timelines are 5, 10, maybe 20 years to really get there. But we can still do something, right?
Thank you, Professor George. I do have one question for Peter, and then I'll come back to you. Peter, you mentioned intangible assets. 90% of S&P 500 company valuation is on intangible assets. So I think there are two-dimensional question to you. Do you ever see a platform company breaking into S&P 500? And then how does the metaverse impact the valuation of companies on the intangible assets? You mentioned accounting standards and everything else. So any thoughts on either parts of the question?
Well, as you may know, the most valuable companies in the world today in terms of market capitalization are platform companies. And if you tally up the top 100 platforms by market capitalization, they now are about $15 trillion. So they've come very rapidly to become a very important economic engines, right? And they're also innovation engines. If you look at patents, the platform companies are generating, because they're at the cutting edge of a lot of technologies. You mentioned AI earlier. The platform companies are driving it, and one of the reasons is that they're very data rich, and how you analyze data, how you manage data, all of those things, they actually excel at, right? And so there's kind of this self-reinforcing, and all of those are intangible assets, right? Your data is an intangible asset. The challenge, of course, is that the accounting standards that were established way back when, about 100 years ago or so, are really designed for a world of tangible assets. And they've struggled. People recognize the issue, but they've struggled a little bit to catch up. And so what you do is you get a disconnect between the true value of the company and the way that it's currently recorded. And so what it does is that it sends the wrong valuation signals to both investors and to senior management in terms of where should they really be investing. And so anyway, so one of the challenges is if there's a team and they're interested in innovating around the metaverse, it's going to be hard to show a concrete ROI on these projects. And so if you're battling another division that can show a rate of return on the investment of a factory, or some other type of tangible investment, it can be challenging. So that was the point I was trying to make out, is that there is tremendous value to be created. Sometimes it's a bit challenging to be able to demonstrate it in the traditional ways in which companies account for, record, and make decisions about future investments.
Thank you, Peter. We have Linda Morris Kelly. Why avatars we can translate data into experiences. And Professor George, I've obviously listened to you speak in the past about beyond 3D, right? How can more dimensional play help leaders make smart decisions? Could you walk us through a little bit of that decision-making science and how the metaverse helps and data as experiences beyond 3D?
Well, those are actually two different things. Usually when we talk about 3D, people think the actual spatial 3D world, like the one we're in. And by far, most of applications of VR, AR, XR having to do with 3D digital representation of actual 3D things. I think what you're referring to are abstract spaces where the coordinates are not spatial XYZ, but something else. They're columns in a spreadsheet. Those are the abstract data spaces, and they underline essentially all of the business analytics today, right? And usually people deal with some form of Excel or similar things. And the problem is that if you have more than 2 columns in your spreadsheet, you start running into problems in trying to visualize things in an effective way. So what we have found, and that was really the basis for our startup Virtualitics, is that you can do a much better, more powerful multidimensional graphics using extended reality platforms. You obviously get XYZ spatial coordinates, but you can also play with things like shapes and sizes and colors and transparencies and animations of data points. So you can encode up to 12 dimensions of these abstract data spaces in what is like pseudo 3D graphs, right? An important point there is that the architecture of these systems that will enable you to do this, to plunge into this new virtual space together with your colleagues who can be anywhere in the world, interact with the data, interact with your colleagues, interact with machine learning. So that architecture is really what is used for game development, things like Unity and Unreal Engine and so on. And that's a very different software architecture from traditional data visualization things, like Excel or Tableau or Mondrian or whatever else you want to use. And they're not easily transformed into each other. So experiments have been done in many different fields that have demonstrated that if you visualize data in an immersive VR or AR, if you're inside the data looking out, as opposed to outside the data looking in through a computer screen, your pattern recognition is triggered much more effectively. You get to understand structures and geometries present in your data much more readily, some of which are completely impossible to understand or see in traditional projection view. And you also remember better what you've seen and what you understood. And so that's why approaching data analytics, coupling this multidimensional data visualization with AI tools and interacting with other people. And of course, VR, XR is all about human interaction and collaboration. That's why it's going to become, and it's already becoming, the winning proposition for any business or other data analytics. So that's the part of what I referred to briefly as what does the future workspace looks like when metaverse is ubiquitous. You will not be working on traditional flat Excel spreadsheets, or you might be, but somebody else would eat your lunch because they know how to use better technologies.
Thank you, Professor George. Peter, as I come back to you, this is an interesting comment from Valerie Hill. And I love the word she uses, born digital, right? So there are a lot of organizations today that are born digital. So they don't need a digital transformation because that's their native. But as you know, in the course that I teach on agility, one of the strong points of view that I have is that we do not have single industry thinking companies anymore. If your company is a singular industry strategy company, most likely or not, you will struggle in 5 to 7 years. Now, the reason I bring that up is that when you're born digital, there's a collision of industries. Cryptocurrencies come into metaverse. Hardware design comes into metaverse. Design by itself is a key element of metaverse. Then you have concepts like gaming coming into metaverse. You have consumer play coming into metaverse. So can you walk us through one or two examples of is metaverse more friendly to certain industries and not to, for example, can I apply a metaverse in an industrial kind of a company as compared to a technology gaming company? Could you give us some examples or thoughts on it?
Sure. I've started to think about it more in terms of use cases. What's the purpose of being in the metaverse? Is it a work function, or is it an entertainment function? And so the activities that you do there will differ as a consequence, although there can be overlap. So, for example, I think now with restrictions due to the pandemic, a lot of companies are realizing, hey, we need to get out there, we need to meet people, but we're restricted from doing that physically. How do we do that virtually? So one example that I've learned about recently that kind of caught my attention is that investment bankers have been restricted on their ability to go out and meet clients physically. So they've become actually quite interested in the metaverse as an alternative mechanism for engaging people. So, I think then it becomes a creative question as to how do you orchestrate an event? And we've seen some superstar events like with Travis Scott in Fortnite. Ariana Grande just did a big event. These tend to be very, very short, up to like 12 to 20 minutes in length. They're highly orchestrated, but millions of people attend at the same time. So those are these kind of very high-end kinds of things. We're also seeing companies recognize that their trade shows or other type of user conferences, there's a tremendous opportunity to turn those into and harness metaverse applications to really drive those in interesting ways that can make them more engaging, build the kind of relationships that they're looking to, and create novelty, but also a better experience for the customers that they're looking to engage. And so I think it's really kind of use case driven rather than industry driven.
Thank you, Peter. Professor George, sorry, go ahead.
I think it's just like the internet itself. There isn't one winning industry. Everything, and I mean literally everything, will be enhanced, boosted, and more importantly, new industries will come about. Nobody needed web search before there was a web, right? And look at Google, right? People could have guessed that something like social media might be useful, but nobody really appreciated what become of things like Facebook and Twitter, right? people could have guessed that, gosh, it would be nice if we can stream video to my home. And that was kind of obvious, and just became technologically enabled. But there are new industries. In fact, if you look, some of the biggest players, they're intrinsically being generated by the ability to do something new and different, or something that used to be done, but they can do it way, way, way better by going online. And the magic of 3D immersion is that it's strongly intuitive. That's why it's more effective. That's why people are trying to do these entertainment events. That's why they're trying to do business meetings in immersive environments. It's just the technology is not quite really there yet for a variety of reasons, graphics, bandwidth, so on and so forth. I mean, I started exploring virtual reality in primitive forms, virtual worlds, like 15 years ago or something like that. One of the things that immediately became obvious is that even back then, even with primitive graphics and all, it was already a killer app for anything that required human interaction. That people were communicating with each other better and more intuitively, remembering things in a different way if they did it through immersion. And so the same thing will now apply as Metaverse truly goes global, if you will.
Appreciate it. Now, we have about 4 minutes left or 3 minutes left. I'm going to leave you both with one question to comment upon, and you can add to any closing comments on it. For leaders in companies, when they sit at the decision tables and they hear the news of Facebook and Visa acquiring an avatar for $150K and the NFTs and the Bitcoins and the Dogecoins, how do you advise that they assimilate? What should be the starting point? How should they learn differently? What would your advice to leaders be to absorb this kind of future trend much better than what we're doing today? So I leave it to both of you to offer that as a closing comment. Peter?
I would say if you're a large company, I would spin up several teams that explore the applications. How it's going to be relevant and significant to the supply chain team will be different from the HR team, which would be different from a product team. All of them can benefit in various ways, but they all need to both understand it and figure out ways that they can grow their business with these technologies. So I wouldn't wait. I would begin teeing that up and starting to let them explore where they see opportunities. And that's a great learning experience so that the organizations become smarter and smarter about all the different applications. And it's becoming quite daunting. Like right now, there are more than 60 NFT platforms that have emerged just in the last year and a half. So there's a lot to absorb, but a lot of people are smart in these companies and they want to help their company grow. So let them go at it and explore and give them the bandwidth to do that and bring back proposals and vet them and make a decision about where the company should start experimenting.
Well, my advice would be hire young people and listen to them, because the digital natives really get the stuff that more senior people don't get always. And this was always the case, but it's now especially the case since we're talking about enabling technologies that evolve at Moore's law pace. And it's really hard to adopt and learn new tricks as you get older. But people who are born as digital natives who had their play dates in Minecraft, who play games and think nothing of it as the most normal thing ever, they have a very different perspective and different expectations of what will they want from the future of internet successor than people who have worked hard their whole life. Now they're maybe in their 60s and they're the big boss of the big company. Beware. The world is very different. It's changing faster than it has ever changed in history. And sometimes people just can't really make good decisions if they're really too far out on the age curve.
Appreciate it. You just ruled me out of 90% of the jobs available in the world today. But hey, thank you so much. I do these conversations with leaders like you, and I call it Prepared with Hari Abburi. But the entire focus is discovering solutions for a world that we fully do not understand yet. And for that, I think I really appreciate both of you taking the time and doing this conversation. And for people in the audience, we love working with leaders to develop their curiosity and change the world. So if you do need to write into us for more information, do that at execed@caltech.edu. And with that, we thank you everyone for joining. Have a wonderful afternoon or evening and a great weekend ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yes.